In this video, Jordan Peterson talks about how to know how social you are and the best way to get out of trouble.
Anyways, we've been shaping each other's behavior for a very, 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 very long time. And a lot of that's encoded deeply in biology and in culture. Now, biologically, and we'll talk about this a lot when we get to the biological section, one of the ways that you can know how social you are is by noting how hurt and ashamed you get if you make a serious social error. You know, so if you're at a party and you make a fool of yourself, you know, depending on your level of neuroticism, which is also a big 5 trait that indexes how sensitive you are to negative emotion, you might obsess about what an idiot you are for the next 3 or 4 months, or maybe even for the next 5 years. You know, people do not like social exclusion. You know, and you have a little counter that's more or less built into the back of your brain that roughly, first of all, it estimates how successful you are. There's an estimation that actually seems to occur right at birth, where when part of your neuroticism levels are set. And then that can be modified to some degree by learning, you know, and if you're a top baboon, well, you're going to experience less negative emotion and more satisfaction than you are if you're a bottom baboon, and it's exactly the same with people. So, you know, we like to be climbing up dominance hierarchies, and we like to be near the top of dominance hierarchies, and if the little counter at the back of your brain notices that, you know, you're doing a good job of climbing towards the top of a relevant dominance hierarchy, then it's going to produce more serotonin, and you're not going to be as in as much pain, you're not going to be as depressed, you're not going to be as anxious, you're not going to be stressed, and so forth. So there's a biological basis for our social being, and it's extraordinarily important to us how we fit into social groups. Okay, so we've also been trying to figure out what the hell we are, who we are, for thousands and thousands of years. Partly as a consequence of imitation, you know, because I can act you out and that'll sort of help me understand what you're like. And partly as a consequence of articulated communication. A lot of that's storytelling. Now, people have been telling stories for we have no idea how long. I mean, if you go and visit peoples that have no written language and who've been isolated from the rest of human society for, say, tens of thousands of years, and such people still exist, you find that they tell stories, they dance, they act each other out, you know. So we know certainly that the propensity to tell stories and to engage in ritual behavior is far older than our ability to write. I suspect you can push it back at least 50,000 years, although I suspect it's a lot older than that. And so what's happened is that across those sorts of timescales, we've started to tell stories about one another that represent how we act. And then you might think, well, some of those stories are interesting and memorable and some of them aren't, and then we tend to remember the interesting and memorable ones and pass them on. And so you can also imagine human beings aggregating together in groups of thousands and thousands of people over thousands and thousands of years, telling their stories to one another and hammering those stories into some sort of mutually acceptable and comprehensible form. And so, for example, one example of that is that if you look at the creation stories, the creation story that, say, occurs in Genesis in the Old Testament, it's a member of a class of creation stories that characterized Middle Eastern mythology, and it seems to have arisen out of the organization of separate Middle Eastern tribes thousands and thousands of years ago, each with their own traditions, into a relatively homogeneous story that characterized a large group of people's central beliefs. So we have information about how we act from the representations that we've made of those actions that we've passed forward. And a lot of those take the form of myths, religious stories. And so part of what we're going to do is we're going to begin the course with 2 foundation establishing themes. One has to do with the structure of mythological representations, and the second has to do with a set of rituals and processes and beliefs that have been identified more or less worldwide that have to do with shamanic transformation. Now, the title of this course is Personality and Its Transformations, and the reason it's titled that way is because you aren't just who you are. You're also something that changes all the time. You're more like a river than like a rock. You're constantly transforming. The physicist Erwin Schrödinger thought that people were dissipative structures. It's a very interesting idea. So a dissipative structure is a structure that maintains its structural integrity while its elements transform completely. So you know when you let the water out of the sink, you get a whirlpool, right? And the whirlpool is a fairly stable entity, but the water that the whirlpool is made of is constantly changing. That's a dissipative structure. Well, that's what you're like. You maintain your form across time, but your elements are constantly transforming. And people are very, very transformative creatures. You know, we can... Unlike animals, really, because animals are sort of what they are and that's it. I mean, they have some capacity to learn, but not very much. Your typical beaver is acting more or less today like, you know, his great-great-great-great-grandfather was acting 5,000 years ago. There's no real accretion of culture. Whereas with human beings, we transform like mad. I mean, we do that culturally. Things aren't much, there's so many things, for example, that are different now than there were 20 years ago that it's almost impossible to imagine. And then, so we transform on a cultural scale quite rapidly. But we also do that individually. I mean, you guys have all just made the transition to university, just roughly speaking. You know, I'm sure that you're like you were in some ways when you were in high school, but, well, hopefully you're better than you were in high school a whole bunch of ways as well. You should be more mature, but your personality may have transformed substantially. You know, and with any luck, you're not done with your sequences of transformations. You know, that's going to be something that characterizes you for the rest of your life, insofar as you're a dynamic person, your eyes are open, you pay attention, and you can learn. And so one of the things you might say is that the most stable thing there is about the human personality is its capacity to transform. And that's really something that's worth knowing, you know, because one of the things I can tell you about the great myths of mankind, there's lots of them and they have different themes, but one of the most powerful themes is the way you get yourself out of trouble is to transform your personality. Now you think, you kind of do that every time you learn something, right? Because you learn something and you're a little different than you were before. Hopefully different in a significant way, and hopefully different in a way that helps you solve some problems that you couldn't solve before. So you could say that one of the leitmotifs of being human is, well, if I encounter an obstacle, I can just transform and I can figure out some way of getting around it. And that's something that makes us quite remarkable. You know, and one of the things that I could suggest to you, and I think this is one of the largest ideas that exist, especially communicable in this short a time, is that it's much better to identify with your capacity to transform than it is to identify with who you are now. And that can get you out of an awful lot of trouble. I mean, one of the things that characterizes ideologues, for example, or people who are trapped in fixed belief systems, is that they worship who they are now. And that'd be all fine if everything was going 100% for them, but it's seldom the case. And so, unless your life is perfect, and that seems highly improbable, maybe if you were someone else, it would be better. And, you know, that's all you've got, in some sense, because changing the world in some way that's going to make you feel better about it, well, you know, you might be able to do that in some small way, but the probability that you could or should try to do that on a large scale it's pretty low. So,